Hi, I'm Adam Elman. I'm a principal conversation designer at Amazon working on Alexa. I'm here today to talk about the tools that we use for doing conversation design. I actually started doing voice and conversation design 21 years ago at a company called Tell Me Networks. Tell Me had a vision for connecting people to information using just their voice. At the time, the only way to achieve that vision was via a phone call. You'd pick up a phone, anything from an old landline to a cell phone, dial an 800 number, and an automated system would answer the call. You'd choose options from a menu: sports, baseball, nationals, and the system would give you the score of the game, or the weather, or stock quote, or whatever else you wanted. Now, by the time I joined in 2001, the first .com crash was in full effect, and so Tell Me had temporarily pivoted towards something that would actually make us some money. So I got my start building interactive voice response systems, or IVRs. If you're not familiar, these are the systems that answer when you call a customer service line for a big company, for example, a bank, an airline, or a telco. If you're lucky, they can help you, or at least quickly get you to a human being who can. But of course, they're widely hated. So when people ask me what I did for a living, I used to tell them, you know those systems that you call and they suck? Yeah, my job is to make them suck less. So anyway, when I designed these systems, I had three primary tools that I would use: a word processor, a spreadsheet, and a diagramming app. I'd use the word processor to start sketching the experience through sample dialogues. Once I had some solid dialogues together that illustrated various paths through the application, I would use the diagramming tool to flow out the call, identifying each of the dialogue states and what kind of things callers would need to say to move between them. And Tell Me, we designers weren't responsible for writing actual grammars, although I know the designers at some other companies were responsible for that. Anyway, once I had the flow figured out, I'd look at all the states and figure out exactly which prompts I needed to write. So I'd go into the spreadsheet and create a recording script, including all the main prompts, error prompts like no inputs and no matches, and all the little lists of things that would need to be recorded for the app, like account types, seat types for a plain thing, things like that. Finally, I'd go back to my word processor and create a spec that would put together the example dialogues with the flow diagrams and any necessary notes about app behavior. At first, the specs weren't all that detailed, since we were working with our own engineering teams and we could just walk over and help if they had questions. But as we started to work with more remote teams, or having clients do their own implementations, we needed more and more detailed behavioral specs that would lay out the detailed behavior for each specific dialogue state. Of course, there were a lot of pain points in this process. One of them was keeping designs up to date. Early in the process, I'd be writing a lot of sample dialogues, and inevitably they'd end up a little inconsistent. I might use one phrasing in one dialogue and a slightly different phrasing in another. When I got to the point of writing the flows and scripts, I'd need to figure out whether the difference was actually meaningful. Should I use one variant under certain conditions and another under other conditions? Would they just be natural variants that I could randomize between? Or should I just consolidate into a single consistent prompt? The problem was that even once I made that decision, there was no way to easily keep all of the sample dialogues and design specs up to date. If I made a change to a prompt late in the process, I'd have to find any instance where I used that prompt in sample dialogues in the spec or in presentations for stakeholders and fix it by hand. Another challenge was prototyping. We needed prototypes for a few things: to present designs to stakeholders, for critiques, and for usability testing. The simplest way to do a quote-unquote prototype was just to read the dialogues out loud, but even that was pretty low fidelity. To get a real demo put together, we'd have to work with our recording engineers to schedule time with the voice talent for the application and record a set of prompts. Generally, just a small subset of what we'd eventually need for the app, but every minute of talent recording time was an expense. Still, it was worth it to be able to put together demos for stakeholders and to be able to create prompt sets that we could use for Wizard of Oz usability testing. For usability tests, we'd have the participant in the room sitting on a phone that was connected to a laptop in the observation room, and the wizard, often the designer themselves, would click on the right prompt to play back in response to what the participant said. The participant never knew that they weren't talking to a live system, so it was great, but it was really labor intensive. Generating detailed specs was another pain point, especially when we started needing to generate really detailed ones. In the mid-2000s, we had a slight evolution when one of our awesome engineers created a tool that automated some of this. You'd have to follow a very specific format when creating your Excel spreadsheet and your Visio diagram, but if you did, you could upload them into this tool, and the tool would spit out a Word document of a detailed behavioral spec. Of course, there was always a lot of manual tweaking that was needed to get the spec into shape to deliver to a client, but it saved a ton of time. As a side effect, it also helped identify gaps in the design, states that didn't go anywhere, or prompts that were missing. The goal in the end was also to get it to spit out code, an actual application that we could set up and use as a demo, but we never quite got it to that point. So here I am, 21 years into this work, and a lot has changed. I'm still proud to be working toward that same vision of just say what you want and get it. But the underlying technologies and a lot of the design challenges are very, very different. Rather than using limited grammars that required highly directed dialogue like menus and lists of options, we can handle fairly open natural language requests. Rather than using recorded audio, we almost exclusively use text-to-speech engines. Rather than designing for a phone call that has a well-defined beginning and end, we're designing for far-field interactions that could be anything from a quick single-utterance question to a lengthy multi-turn conversation. And of course, many of the devices we're designing for nowadays have screens as well as microphones and speakers. Speaking of those screens, when I look over at our colleagues on the visual experience design side, I see the massive evolution of their tool sets over the past couple of decades. From the early days of using Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator to modern dedicated UX design tools like Sketch, Adobe XD, and Figma. All of those tools today have extensive capabilities not just for creating visual mock-ups, but also interactive prototypes. These tools make it much easier to define entire design systems with component libraries so that a designer can just drag a button out onto a canvas and know that that button will automatically have all the right colors, type ramps, typefaces, and behaviors for the design system. And if the design system gets tweaked, the button will automatically update. In some cases, those tools even have capabilities for generating detailed engineering specs. But in conversation design, the truth is, I'm really still using the same 3 primary tools that I was using 20 years ago. I still start by writing sample dialogues in a word processor, then I flow out conversational paths in a diagramming app, and then eventually I write prompt tables and design specs that lay out the expected behavior at each point in the conversation. Some things have become a lot easier. Since we're using text-to-speech, I never have to worry about scheduling recording time to get a demo put together. I plug my prompts into Amazon Poly and instantly get audio that I can embed into a Keynote or PowerPoint presentation to share to stakeholders. If I use a tool like VoiceFlow, I can quickly turn my flow diagrams into live Alexa skills that I can play with myself or have others test out. Although it would be nice to be able to sometimes create Wizard of Oz versions that could be driven by human beings rather than having to encode fake business logic. Anyway, those 2 things have made presenting designs a lot easier, at least for voice-centric presentations. It's when I need to integrate screens and multimodality that things can get a little tricky. It's easy enough to put static images into a Keynote or PowerPoint presentation for a quick demo, and both VoiceFlow and Adobe XD have the capability to deploy prototypes to an actual Alexa-enabled device with static images. XD even has some capabilities about interactive visual prototypes that can be combined with voice, although I don't think they work on the actual Alexa device. Nobody has a really effective workflow for taking screen mock-ups from a visual design tool like Sketch or Figma and connecting them directly to a conversational prototype as yet, though. And of course, nobody has really solved the problem of keeping sample dialogues or design specs synchronized with changes to a conversation design. It'd be awesome to be able to define a set of prompts, and then if I need to change the wording, have that automatically reflected in sample dialogues, presentations, and specs. Even better, would be the ability to create true conversation design components, reusable snippets of dialogue, maybe even code, that encode our best practices and could just be dropped into an application design. That's a hard problem, especially given the necessary variance in wording between any two applications, even if they're similar. But there's definitely some possibility there, perhaps around things like confirmations. So, in closing, I'm not necessarily complaining that the tools I use today are very, very similar to the tools I used when I started in conversation design 21 years ago. The problems are fundamentally different and interesting, and that's what keeps me showing up for work every day. But it sure would be nice to see further evolution on some of these pain points and improvements that would give us conversation designers the kind of evolution we've seen on the visual design side. I think tools like VoiceFlow are a great first step, but we've got a ways to go. Thanks so much for your time, and have a great day.